questions or concerns you may have, and I will repeat your questions. This gentleman first.
This week, the Trump administration imposed tariffs on washing machines, I believe it was, also solar panels. I'd like to hear what you think the Chinese response might be to this, and if this is maybe the first shot in some sort of trade war between the two countries.
All right, so this question is about economic sanctions from Trump administration to China only recently, and he wants to know about what it implies to the economic sanctions or further economic sanctions or the trade wars between China and the United States. And did I get it right?
Tariffs, I believe they were, not sanctions.
The tariffs on the solar panels and washing machines.
Okay, got it. So the tariffs. Sorry about that. So, and do I want to get one by one or like, yeah, we can, I can get a question.
Would you please comment on the naval activity by China in the South China Sea and the threat to the Philippines, Vietnam, and Singapore and associated countries?
All right, so this is more about the naval activities that China is conducting in the South China Sea, and this gentleman would like to know what that implies or what kind of threat it can pose to the major Southeast Asian countries, including Philippines, Vietnam, and Singapore. Right. Okay. Let's deal with these two questions first. We can take more questions later. So first of all, trade war. I have two thoughts about this. One thing, I was wondering, like, this might be just kind of like a show, or it's going to be just kind of a gesture that Trump administration is taking against China. In other words, it's not going to be, in my opinion, I don't think it's going to be escalate into further tariffs or other sanctions or like other kind of economic trade conflicts with China. And here's why. I think, first of all, and that may be just my bias against President Trump, and I feel like his approach first is quite transactional. So if he actually wants to conduct further, increase further tariffs against China, and that really damages China-U.S. trade relationship, I would anticipate that first China would do something in return. Say that, okay, like let's talk about it and let's decide like how to deal with this issue if you are truly unhappy. Because a trade war, like regardless when we talk about a real war or like trade war, anything could become war, or anything is not going to escalate to war if one side decides to cool it down. It decides to back down. Either it could be United States or China. So if China decides to, okay, I'm going to give you some benefits, and that's just cool this whole trade dispute down, and I think Trump would accept that. And the other thing is that right now I think U.S. government also needs China's support in lots of issues, especially in the North Korean nuclear issues. Although again, Trump might not be very happy about how much China has been doing for now, but still, China's support is essential if the United States wants to address the North Korean nuclear issue. So I think that could also counterbalance against this economic potential trade disputes between China and the United States. And so that would be my thoughts about that. And about China's South China Sea disputes, I think this might be a little similar, in my opinion, related to North Korea nuclear issue. And I think when Mr. Xi came to power, and because he really wanted to assert China's position in the region and in the international world as well. So one thing he did very, very differently from the previous administration was that the previous administration, right, remember that they wanted to reassure Southeast Asian countries that China is going to rise peacefully. And what they did 10 years ago was to tell those Southeast Asian countries that we are going to set aside our territory disputes and focus on develop and the energy or like resources in the region together. So that was the principle back then. And so she wanted to have a very different policy, and that's why I think in his first couple of years, he actually initiated several radical moves in the area by like building military bases and like really asserting China's rise in the region. But I think once he made his position clear, I would be skeptical that he will go even further than that. So now it's kind of in a new equilibrium where China makes its point clear and other Southeast Asian countries also understand China's point clear. But I don't think both sides, or like, especially from China, is going to seek further confrontation with those countries. And you can see it from after the Hague tribunals come up with the resolution that against China's claim in the area. Even though domestically Chinese people were angry, very, very angry, and Chinese official media totally did not accept that ruling at all. But outside, we actually see an improvement between of the relationship between China and Philippines. So I think for now, especially if in the next 5 years, the Belt and Road Initiative was something that Xi Jinping is really wanted to promote, and is the legacy that he wants to keep, I think he would prioritize that Belt and Road Initiative and try to recover the relationship with those Southeast Asian countries. Thank you. Yes?
First of all, thank you for the presentation. It was excellent.
Thank you.
Here's my question. Until recently, Britain, France, and to much lesser extent, the United States were the foreign dominant powers in Africa. Now China is. I didn't quite understand that until I listened to your brief presentation, because every new infrastructure right now from the East Coast, West Coast seems to be, constructed by China. Here's my question. And I've asked so many people about this, I've never got a satisfactory answer. What is China's grand strategy in Africa?
Okay, so this question is actually simple to summarize. What is the grand strategy of China in Africa? So I will try my best to answer that question. And I think my answer would just borrow Professor Lin's answer, because I am not an expert in like foreign aid and political economy, but his point makes full sense of me, so I will try to summarize his point. I think China's grand strategy in Africa is politically just gaining more influence. I mean, I don't think it's trying to replace United States, at least for now. I think even though we are seeing more influential role that China is playing nowadays, but still China is just a newcomer as a potential or rising world leader. And by no means I think China is trying to make it very aggressive, that just intimidating everyone without rising to that place yet. So I think China is definitely gaining political influence, but it's going to be gradual and it's trying to be very moderate for now. And China's government is, I think, fully understanding the potential concerns in those African countries and other developing countries about the predating behaviors that those companies or Chinese government may be playing. So I think the government is very cautious about that. But again, how well this kind of caution would be translated into real action, and how much this caution would be perceived by people in Africa is another question, right? So there are some potential risks that may actually go against the cautious behaviors of China. One thing would be just related to the real practice of those SOE state-owned enterprises, of their daily practice, right? So even though the Chinese government, before sending those companies overseas, those companies actually receive lots of, I would say, trainings or instructions about you need to keep low file, you need to be humble, you need to keep away from being interfere into domestic affairs, just focus on all those infrastructure projects and be friendly with local people. I think they all receive this kind of instruction, but still how well this is going to be implemented may be another question. So politically wanted to gain influence, but as I mentioned before, there is still question about how China's image is going to be received. And the other thing is just related to the economic concern. I think China is just want to transfer those excessive capacity of production to developing countries. So in the past decade, China tried to reduce it by promoting domestic consumption, and that did not work very effectively. And China tried to invest in Western countries. That ended up not very productively as well, and that's why Professor Lin decided, okay, investing in developing countries, African countries, for example, is the way to go. So I think what China wants to achieve in those countries is just by investing in infrastructure projects, even though they may not be able to receive the money back, even though the bad situation would be those African countries are not able to pay back the money, but still it creates more job opportunities for Chinese companies and Chinese workers. And that is already good for the purpose of generating job opportunities within China. And that would be the two parts of the goals that China wants to achieve in Africa, in my opinion. Yes.
You mentioned that trying to promote domestic consumption wasn't as good a solution, but the main bulk of the BRI, as I see it up there, that's dotted, not red, is the internal infrastructure within the country rather than the peripheral, which seems to be of more interest economically, perhaps, and engaging outside funds. But what about the role of using the BRI for the same thing that they're doing in Africa or other countries internally within China itself? Wouldn't the reward be just as good, or why wouldn't it, if you did the infrastructure building within the country?
Okay, this is a very good question. So this question is about, I've talked a lot about infrastructure projects overseas, but we can see from the map that you are absolutely right. There are lots of projects and that are actually conducted within China and are considered as part of BRI projects. And would that be good that also develop those projects within China? And the answer is yes, absolutely, you're right. And there are actually lots of advantages of using those money to develop domestic projects within China. First, because it's fully under China's control, and so it's actually much faster to get it initiated, get it started, and get it done within China without the coordination with other partner countries. And so this is actually easier to do. And a lot of projects are they may actually still in the planning stage in partner countries, but the portion of the railway projects or the portion of, say, oil pipelines or gas pipelines are already started within the Chinese territory. So I think that is absolutely right, and that is absolutely beneficial for Chinese domestic politics as well. But I think because of the international orientation of this project, the whole project or the whole initiative would not be considered successful if all these projects are only conducted domestically and without any international influence. And that would just not fully fulfill all the goals that Chinese government wanted to pursue. So yeah, so there are two sides. It's absolutely benefiting Chinese domestic economy and Chinese domestic people, but if the Chinese government at the end of the day was not able to moving forward all these international part of the projects, and that would not achieve all the purposes that Chinese government wanted to achieve. I think you have a question? Yes.
You've been stressing how mindful China has been to, I guess, encourage everyone of their peaceful rise, of how intentional they've been about that. But recently there has been a buildup of their military capabilities. Would you think that should indicate a shift in their priorities or their mindset, or is it an economic tool?
Okay, this is a very good question. So the question asks about, so while Chinese government emphasized the thesis of peaceful rise, and so what does that imply, or like does that go against with some recent movements of Chinese government, such as building military bases or like asserting more powers in the neighboring areas? I think you're right, and the answer is, well, of course, first of all, like the Chinese government will never claim that it's aggressive power. That's the whole thing. But the emphasis of peaceful rise was more about the legacy from the previous administration, Mr. Hu Jintao. And like, although now Xi Jinping, again, like Xi Jinping will never claim that China is aggressive power, is going to use like violent methods or non-peaceful methods to deal with all the disputes. But you rarely hear that Xi Jinping mentioned something like peaceful rise. And so peaceful rise as a slogan or as a principle was really a legacy from Hu. And if you just look at Hu's foreign practice, and it's actually quite consistent with that peaceful rise, that first of all, China was not very enthusiastic about being the stakeholder or being engaged into international affairs as expected or as encouraged by the United States back then. And second, as I mentioned earlier, like China really used lots of ways to reassure those Southeast Asian countries that we are not going to bring up this territory dispute issues, and we are just going to work together, cooperate with each other together, and try to find out a way to develop, to exploit the natural gases or other resources together. So that was 2002 from 2012. And you see this whole shift during Xi administration. So that's why I think if we just want to focus on peaceful rise as a slogan of the party propaganda or like party promotion, I think you're right that the current administration is walking away from that. But nonetheless, I think China is still not trying to seek like military approach to address all these issues. They just want to keep that assertive position that okay, we are actually going to talk about this. We actually now care about this South China Sea. We are no longer going to set aside those disputes, and we are going to be more assertive about China's rise. But maybe how to resolve these issues exactly, and they may still go back to like peaceful negotiation. But before that, China wants to make its point clear that we are done with the past, that we are just going to let it go, and now we are actually really care about this area. Okay. Yes. this question is about US debt and about how China is going to refinance the US debt, right? That is a question I'm not entirely sure. I think China, because I'm not a expert in international finance, but what I think what China would do is really just, I think that's the other way that maybe we would actually see the improvement between China and US relationship during this current administration, because both leaders are actually, so previously US leaders, while emphasizing economic issues and financial issues, they also have high standards about the moral standards and human rights issues and other issues that the Chinese government was not very happy to talk about. But the current administration doesn't really care too much about that, and so or at least they can see it as a chance. It can be trade with other economic and business benefits. So I think what China could do is not too much, other than just trying to work with the United States to make sure that U.S. economy is continuing to grow, and China may be actually trying to see that how China can have some input in that process. But other than that, I don't think China can do much with those that, instead of, okay, just concluding that we're not going to invest too much in U.S. debts anymore, instead just turning our attention to other developing countries. Yes.
Based on your earlier graphic showing the impressive rate of economic growth in China and the extent of their planning for future international business development represented by the BRI, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that the Chinese are remarkably good capitalists. Outside of being run by an entity known as the Chinese Communist Party, should we be thinking of China or consider China a communist country any longer?
Okay, the question is, China is really acting as a capitalist, or CCP is really acting as the capitalist party, or the Chinese economy is really acting as a capitalist economy, and should we still consider as CCP? Are you asking would CCP still go back to communist?
Well, isn't that China a communist nation today, and what's the future?
The answer is no. In my opinion, China, CCP is no longer a communist party for, I don't know, quite a long time, in my opinion. Although, in papers, domestically, they still want to highlight a lot about these communist ideas by conducting campaigns in, say, universities, and also by establishing party branches within state-owned enterprises, and now even some private companies as well. But all these kind of still look like communist campaigns or movements are no longer about that ideology itself. It's just a way for CCP to increase and enhance control in wherever it wants to. So so CCP is quite effective in maintaining and increasing control to a very, very grassroots level, I would say. So it's very effective in reaching out to people and to maintain the loyalty from the people, even though has nothing to do with communism. And that's why I say during my presentation that the party has to find some alternative political foundation, which for now is nationalism, to kind of mobilize people, or to find a common ground for all Chinese people, but it's no longer about communism.
I'd like to return to North Korea for just a moment. While the United States clearly views North Korea as a threat, a nuclear threat, China obviously
it. So the question is about why the United States views North Korea as a threat. China may not view North Korea in the same way, and this gentleman want me to elaborate a little bit about how China actually views North Korea. So I think it's mixed. Like the short answer is, because of the past that China and North Korea shared during the Cold War, and they fought together against the United States during the North Korean War. And so China and North Korea definitely formed a close friendship or alliance because of that historical legacy. And that is why, and that is why that China still view North Korea as an ally in that sense. And also from the other perspective of, like, say, geopolitical perspective and economic concerns, China does not want to see the collapse of North Korea regime. And that is absolutely true until nowadays. But that said, though, China and I think Chinese government also view North Korea more and more as a troublemaker as well. That China was definitely not happy with the nuclear development in the Korean peninsula. And I believe that China has done everything it could within its capacity or within its tolerance to persuade North Korea and to discourage North Korea from doing this. But I think Kim Jong-un, because he did not have that same relationship with China as his father and his grandfather did. So I think Kim Jong-un, like, if I could kind of put myself in his shoes and really think about what his mind is working, which is very difficult. And I think he wants to keep distance from his father and grandfather and have his own policy. And this is something that may be common for all the new leaders, especially when they are not very secure about their power foundation. And so they really want to do something dramatic or different. And it's very difficult to pull them back. And that's how I understand why Kim Jong-un keep developing the nuclear weapons or nuclear program. And that's why, in that sense, China really views it as a troublemaker. And when you think about the six-party talks 10 years ago during the Bush administration, domestically in China, there were not many voices about viewing North Korea as a troublemaker, and they still kind of think about, okay, China needs to work with North Korea and China needs to support North Korea and to counterbalance the United States. But this kind of voice is declining significantly recently. One article that you can find in Foreign Affairs, I think in 2011 or 2012, the article was written by a Chinese international relations scholar called Mr. Zhu Feng. And so I think the title is China's New North Korea Legacy or something like that. I forgot, sorry. But the point of his article is that China really needs to revisit its unconditional alliance or friendship with North Korea and really realize that North Korea could be a potential troublemaker in the region. And I think that's the mindset of Chinese government as well. But still, the bottom line is China did not want to see the collapse of North Korea. And China did not want to see the nuclear issue is going to be solved not peacefully. So China would try whatever it can to prevent the collapse of North Korea from happening and from solving the nuclear issue in a violent way. But that's why, in that sense, I think it's mixed. It definitely sees Kim Jong-un as a troublemaker. Yeah. Thanks.
More questions?
Yes.
As a result of the initiatives you're describing, is the gap between the haves and have-nots in China increasing or decreasing? And if it's increasing,
The gap between what?
the haves and have-nots, people of wealth and people.
Okay.
Yeah. Is it increasing or decreasing? And if it's increasing, what is the Chinese government
Okay, very good question. So how does this Belt and Road Initiative address, improve or alleviate, how does it affect the inequalities between the rich and the poor in China? And I think some of the audience also asked me the same question during the break. The short answer is still early to say, and personally, I'm a little bit suspicious about that, about how this initiative itself can reduce the economic inequalities in China. And I get that impression mainly because, mainly by reading those articles from those scholars. My sense is that even though they mention about economic inequalities of the Belt and Road Initiative, but compared to reducing the excessive capacity of production in China, they don't really have a clear picture about how the Belt and Road Initiative would exactly address the economic inequalities in China. And speaking of the economic inequalities, I think scholars would turn more to the domestic solution, such as investing in more social welfare, and also try to come up with some ways to transfer the wealth that have been accumulated in corporations to the people. And the second, the latter approach, when I think about it more closely, that might have something to do with the Belt and Road Initiative, by considering like how these initiatives might be generating job opportunities, and in that sense and encourage those companies to invest in developing countries. And that might be an indirect way to transfer the money, the capital in those corporations, state-owned enterprises, to the people, the workers, as salaries, as compensation. That might be a way, but I don't know how effective that would be in the long run. Yeah, but we still need to see. Yes?
Could you comment on the current state of access to social services, such as healthcare and education without fees in China today?
Okay, so the question is about the current social development, such as wealth, such as education and healthcare in China. I don't know much about healthcare as long as it's kind of messy. And I think Chinese government has not come up with a good solution yet, even though they are fully aware of the problem. But and they try to do some reforms in terms of health insurance and deal with the relationship between the patient and doctors in China. That has been very problematic recently. But in terms of education, I think all I can say is not much about the social development, but more about, I think, how Chinese people in general are anxious about public education and their children's education. And they keep pushing governments to do more in terms of providing quality education. But in general, I think the problem of education in China is not about the quality, it's about the distribution. And like the good quality education will only accumulate in the cosmopolitan cities, those major cities, but not so much in the rural areas. And that has been a problem. And that was okay, I think, 20 years ago when I was in school, and there was not a huge gap between the public education in the rural areas and also in the urban areas. All public educations are generally to be fine. And as my impression was that if you work hard enough, and even though you were from rural areas, you will be able to get access and get accepted to the top universities in China. And that did not exist. I will not say that does not exist anymore, but it's more and more difficult for children in rural areas that are able to compete with those children in urban areas. And I think the government is well aware of these problems, and they try to find a way to address that, but the effect is still not very optimistic.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
This is her first public speaking event since coming to OPU, and I think she did a great job. Yes, Jefferson Cup, thank you very much, and as a token, so we very much appreciate it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this, thank you.
All right, and so we'll see you next week when we'll talk about global health.